All right, we are back. Our next session is, I typed something wrong. Our next session is with Jeremy Wilken. He's going to be talking to us about building Angular 2 apps with TypeScript. And let me just do a quick introduction here. Jeremy is a longtime Angular dev working at Teradata, crafting Angular applications and focusing on user testing and usability. He lives in Austin, Texas, and is a certified beer judge who makes some pretty decent brews. We'll let you take it from here, Jeremy.
All right, thanks. Let me get my keynote going here. I gotta share screen, go. All right, can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see the screen.
Excellent. So we're going to go over Angular 2 from the perspective of actually building an entire app and leveraging TypeScript as part of the tool chain. A lot of people, I think, have seen pieces of what Angular 2 looks like, maybe what a component looks like or how a service is generated. And we have here in this presentation an entire application to take a look at and see how these things all meld together to create an entire application. Especially if you're familiar with Angular 1, you can see a lot of the differences, but also a lot of the same concepts that are still underpinning the entire application. So it'll be a whirlwind tour. There'll be a lot more than I can even provide here, but this gets a pretty good overview of a lot of the major features. First, I am Jeremy. As said, I live in Austin, and I've been working with Angular since the .9 releases, so I don't remember exactly when that was, but it was the Wild West of breaking changes every week. So that was a lot of fun during the time. And since then have obviously worked with every version since then. I also wrote Ionic in Action. So I'm a big Ionic fan and have used it a lot in my work. And also working on an Angular 2 book to come out soon. And in my spare time, I do a lot of brewing, and usually it's pretty good. Let's take a look at the ecosystem from a high level first. We have the Angular framework, which will be more of a bunch of pieces instead of, it's more of an ecosystem than just a framework like we think of Angular 1. There are going to be a lot of pieces to Angular 2, and it's going to be a lot more pluggable. You'll be able to choose things as you wish and not always be bound to doing things, quote, the Angular way, which we have heard a long time in the Angular 1 world. But Angular 2 is built from the ground up pretty much from scratch, leveraging two new tool sets, which are ES6, ES7, ES Next, ES whatever they're going to call it next. Basically new ECMAScript features that are coming down the pipe. Some of them are fully standard, and some of them will likely be standard in the next version. But in general, these are all new things that I'll talk about in a little bit here, as well as TypeScript, which is a way of enforcing strict types into JavaScript, which a lot of people think, oh, JavaScript is not a typed language. There's no such thing as types, and that's actually not true. JavaScript already has types. It has primitive types for undefined numbers, strings, objects, and these things are actually all objects, but these primitive types are inherent in JavaScript already. There's just a caveat that you do not enforce a particular variable to be a particular type. So a variable foo equals a string. Well, it could equal a string now, and then later on I could assign a number, or I could assign null, or I could assign an object. JavaScript doesn't care. TypeScript's real value comes in enforcing that you start with a string and you only make it a string. And so that's a big thing that can really help development teams avoid some minor problems. So in a nutshell, ES6, some of the features, there are classes, modules, promises, arrow functions, generators. There's a lot more coming down the pipe. There are tools like Babel, which empower other features that aren't even quite yet ready in experimental mode. So far, it's additive only. It doesn't actually remove anything existing. So everything you write today still works in the future, which is a backwards compatible type approach to evolving JavaScript. And most features, probably 95% of the things that are coming down the pipe for ECMAScript and JavaScript can actually still be written in ES5, which is the current version today. However, there are a couple of concepts that don't quite translate into today's code. And so there's some really advanced stuff that maybe doesn't quite translate literally one-to-one, but there are ways of kind of working around it. So ES6 in general is just an evolution. It's adding new features, making syntax cleaner, making things that we do already much easier than we do them today. And then TypeScript, it's first and foremost, it's a transpiler. It will read a bunch of TypeScript code and convert it into JavaScript. And it can convert it into ES6, 5, or even as old as ES3, which is years and years ago now. But the big thing, as I mentioned, was that it adds strict typings to the variables. And it does that only by extending the syntax of JavaScript slightly. And I'll show you some examples real quick before we dig into the code. But you'll see how TypeScript is really just JavaScript with a little bit of stuff sprinkled in to add that extra annotation to the code. So before we actually look at some of the code in the app, I wanted to give you a quick primer on the features of ES6 and TypeScript and what they look like. So these are things that you're going to see in this code base. So the first is the let keyword. Instead of using var, we use let. And the big difference is that it does not accidentally bleed into a global scope or an upper scope. So let assigns a variable to the current block scope only, and then it's done. Afterwards, you can't reach into another part of your application and try and pull it out. If you're familiar, there's some ways of declaring variables in JavaScript in different places. They may be global, they may not. And this helps to clarify exactly where this variable can be reached or not. There are multi-line template strings. This is one of my favorites. I love this. Instead of having to write these quotes with plus signs at the end to concatenate large strings together, I can just use a backtick symbol. And that lets me just write pure HTML code straight in. And I don't have to do anything to escape outside of if I'm going to use like the $sign here. And this $sign braces is a way of binding a value into that. So if this was rendered, it would say template by Jeremy instead of template by $brace name. So we have binding in Angular, of course, but this is actually a native first-class feature now in ES6. It's a little bit more limited. It's only for primitive values, I think. It doesn't have like the ability to bind like we do in some of the things in Angular, but it's cool that it's there. Arrow functions, another one of my favorites. Arrow functions replace function declarations that you would normally include a .bind to this. And what that means, if you take a look here, we have two scopes really. We have the class scope, which is what the constructor and add, both of these functions are in the same scope. But then we have this for each. And normally you would have a function, parentheses, stock, and then you'd have your braces and then everything there. And that would actually create a new scope. And then this .add would reference this function instead of down here able to actually reach add. So what it does is it creates basically the same thing as a .bind this to the function, instead with this syntax of arrow function. So now this function takes on its parent's lexical scope, and therefore this refers to its parent and not to itself. And this really helps with how many times if you've seen JavaScript code with the keyword this, and sometimes it references what you think and sometimes it doesn't, because the keyword this references the call site, and it becomes very confusing. So things like this are cleaning up the syntax of what this means. However, it's not a wholesale replacement for just functions. You can still use functions as they exist, but they'll have the same behaviors they do today. It is a really useful keyword, or I'm sorry, keyword, but syntax for binding the lexical scope to the child. And then classes, you saw, this is another sample of a class. Classes are really no different than function constructor type objects that we've created for a long time. Angular has these in Angular 1 all over the place. And so this is a syntax that kind of masks over that, and it allows us to write something a bit more clean and consistent. And so they can take a constructor, which is going to fire when the class is instantiated for the first time. So later on, I could do let my dashboard equal new dashboard, and I would be able to create a new dashboard with that through the class, and it would also run this constructor method. And you can see we have methods are declared with braces. There's no function name here, but it's implied by the way that it's set up. Classes don't have, you can't put a property up here. You have to define them here in the constructor by this dot value. So you're really only able to declare a class with methods inside of it, and then everything inside of the methods orchestrates everything that goes on. You'll see a lot of these as well. ES6 modules. Now, in Node, we have the require statement. You can require modules from different places. So modules are a first-class citizen in Node.js. Now with ES6, they become a first-class citizen in all JavaScript. Basically, the syntax is different, but a lot of the concepts are the same. So when we want to import something, we would require it. Perhaps if you use require.js or something, you could use those syntax in the past. Now in ES6 flavor is I'm going to import this particular thing, which is, in this case, it's called service, from this module, which is, this is a path to that module. So it would be a file named service in the same directory. And later, inside of that, we would be exporting things. So you can only import something that's being exported in a module. So a module becomes this self-contained piece. Your code stays inside of that file only. Like in Node, if you write something in a particular, if you write something in a module, you can't reach it unless you export it. And the same thing happens here. And so we are going to be exporting some of our classes in order to import them elsewhere and use them in different places. Excuse me. Another feature are ES7, most likely going to be an ES7 feature called Decorators. And these are basically annotations on top of an object. And so in this case, we're going to be leveraging component annotation. Actually, the annotations, not quite the same thing, but Angular creates annotations using decorators. So I kind of use the word interchangeably sometimes. But these component annotations, which are actually decorators, but they annotate this app class. And it provides this metadata called, with an object of selector equals app in this particular case. So if you think about how directives are defined, which we had a great talk on the other day by Jeff, I think. So with those directives, you had an object, and all those properties modified everything. Well, one of the properties is a controller. Think of it now with something like this. We can define a controller as a class, and then all that other metadata gets to be annotated above it inside of something like a component annotation. And that allows us to describe it without actually writing all that code inside of the controller. Our controllers stay lean and become easier to test. Everything in the annotation is metadata. It's not essential to the behavior of the controller. It's essential to the implementation that it's used later on. So you'll see component, you'll see view, and if I might steal some of Mike's thunder, but Ionic has created some of their own decorators that Ionic will use in the future versions as well. So you can create your own in order to annotate different things in your own use cases. We have TypeScript now with an interface and type declarations. So what we have with TypeScript is the ability to describe an object, not just say, oh, this is an object, but I can actually say, what are the properties of an object? What should they be and what type should they be? And so this is an interface. An interface is simply a definition of what a particular variable should contain. So this interface is the stock interface. We want it to have a symbol. It's going to be the stock symbol, whatever is on the trading board, and that's a string. We want the last trade price, so that'd be like whatever the last price that was sold it at. That's a number. The change in dollars up and down is a number, and change in percent is also a number. So these things describe, though, 4 properties of the stock object, and each of those properties we can check to make sure that we assign the proper value to each of them. So if I tried to assign a number as the symbol, TypeScript would error to me and say, hey, you can't do that. You can also annotate individual properties, and you'll see a few of those in the code as well. But then you can do more complex things as well. So we have a stocks array here, and we can define it as an array of stock interfaces. So we could say that that array must contain only objects that conform to this particular definition of an object. And if something's passed to it that's not a stock, it will warn you and let you know, and TypeScript will throw an error. Lots and lots of value there, especially for larger applications and people who are very familiar with types already. And I think there's a lot of value for people who aren't familiar as much with how strong types work, if you give it a little bit of a chance. But at the same time, all of this is still optional. And then the last piece is a reference. You'll see a tag like this, and it's going to reference basically definitions. So that interface that I showed you just a second ago, for libraries like Angular or Ionic, what happens is when all of that code gets transpiled through TypeScript, it outputs as JavaScript. And so all that typing definition actually has to be stripped out because it's not valid JavaScript. And so what happens is that can get dumped into a definition file, which basically is like a source map for types. It allows you to reference all of the original types that a variable or a method or anything contained, so that your IDE knows what's going on, so TypeScript knows what's going on, and it can compile correctly based on the original types, even if you don't have the source code of the TypeScript written in your project. Because most of the time you're going to be importing the built assets, for example. In our example, we'll be using actually the source code because we're still kind of in the early stages of Angular 2. But sooner or later, that'll get compiled into nice bundled projects that you can just import the finished built assets. So this is the repository. If you want to pull it up, Angular, github.com/angular-in-action/hello-world. I'm going to be showing you code and the actual implementation, what it looks like. And then you can follow along and ask specific questions, or I also encourage people to fork it and see if you can come up with a new feature or make an improvement of some sort. Feel free. And I always have to warn, Angular 2 is not quite ready, so anything you see here is subject to change. But at this point, Angular 2 core, what you're going to see here is pretty solid. So most of the things should remain there. Maybe little things will tweak the way that we instantiate something, or maybe some of it will just get to disappear because they've come up with a nicer, simpler way of doing some stuff. But in general, you'll see the structure and the way that everything will most likely look in Angular 2. So before I jump into the code, here are the highlights of things we're going to look at. So there's the base, which is kind of the scaffolding. There's a Gulp build project that also has a local server. You could use JSPM, Webpack, fill in the blank. There's several different examples out there of people who've built kind of a scaffolding for Angular 2 right now. And Brad said the other day they're going to work on kind of a default one that they're going to use in the documentation. So I assume that will most likely be a popular one when that is done. So there's an app component. The app component is kind of a all-encompassing thing. It's going to reach out and envelope everything that the rest of our application will do. You could think of this as ng-app to a degree, and it's going to be a little bit more complex than that originally, but you'll see how we put that together, and then that becomes how we bootstrap. We have a stock service. So the example I told you is a stock app. It's going to load the current prices for a number of different stocks. That lets you change the number of add new stocks to add to the list, and so you can see your own little dashboard of current stocks. So you'll see in a moment it was a particularly bad day for the ones that I selected. So it's not. No, it's a little bit red, but the stock service is used to actually go out and grab that data from Yahoo Finance, and so it's an implementation of the HTTP service in Angular 2, as well as a little in-memory cache, basically. We have a summary component. So in Angular 2, components are really central, and you'll see how that plays out. But there's a little component that's going to be a card, and that's going to show the details of a particular stock. And so we'll loop over and have different versions of the summary component displayed. So you'll see several of them. It will have some types. There's some bindings. There's a couple directives in there. There's the dashboard component, which is going to be kind of the whole page all at once. We're going to kind of orchestrate a whole bunch of things together. So it's neat to see how you're going to be leveraging multiple components in the same component. There's the manage component, which is another one that will leverage the stock service, but it primary use case is to show us how events will work, how forms can behave, at least in a basic way. So you can see how those features from Angular 1 vary from Angular 2. And then the router. So a router, this is the Angular 2's new router. And one of the things Brad mentioned is that you actually have an option. You can still use something else. It's not a strict requirement to use this router, but we have the router here in the example. So let's take a look at the application, and I'm going to walk through some of those pieces. So this is the application. So what happens is it starts to load, it goes out, grabs the data from Yahoo Finance, and you can see Apple went down a little, Google went down 2.2, Facebook went down, Amazon, Twitter, everybody went down yesterday. Wasn't a particularly good day for blue chips, I guess. But this is the dashboard page. So this is the summary component again and again and again and again. So it's iterated on however many stocks that we created in the list. And then the whole view here is the dashboard component. And then the whole page is the app. So the dashboard only is the white space, and then the app also includes everything you see in the browser. On the manage view, we have everything below the nav bar, and you can see we can add or remove things. So I can remove Facebook and Amazon and say I want to put eBay in here. If I go back to the dashboard, it will reload with those new stock list. So you get to see a little bit of state. Things are happening. Reasonable use case for an app. Obviously, lots of things that could be done, lots of niceties that we could add, but the guts are there. So let's take a look at the code. First off, we have our project. So if we take a look on the left side here, everything in the client folder is the application that we're writing. We have a typings directory, and this contains those definitions. So here are those references. These references are loading other references, but so this is what a Angular 2 type definition looks like, and this is quite a large file. We're talking about how many, 10,000 lines or something, 11, 12. 12,000 lines in order to accurately describe every single aspect of Angular 2. So it's quite large, but that's only used during the build. Doesn't get published to your site and loaded in the browser. So it's only for this annotation and makes the editor aware of things. So typings get dropped into there. We have our gulp file. We have a package. We have some TSD, tsconfig. Those are TypeScript things that we have configured. I'm not going to go into too much depth on those, but we have right now 1.5 is the version of TypeScript, and these are the compiler options I have set, and it knows to grab these files when it's trying to compile from TypeScript to JavaScript. The dist folder is what gets compiled out to. So you can see we've got our components here. And so everything that you'll see in the client directory gets dropped into here with a JavaScript version as well as a source map. We have some of our other stuff dropped in here. And then the libraries and all the things that we need are also dropped in there. So the server will pull from the dist directory. And I have a little server already running here. So it's gulp go is the command. It just runs through, builds the application for the first time, and then starts a server at 8080 on your local host, and that's what you saw running just a moment ago. So it also is watching. If I save or change anything, it'll rebuild the TypeScript app right away, and you can reload the browser. So that's the structure behind how this all kind of gets bundled and built together. Some of that stuff's going to get cleaned up. Perhaps there'll be the Angular CLI tool will do a lot of this behind the scenes and make a lot of this much nicer. So I'm looking forward to that down the road. So this is our index. This is obviously the entry point for any Angular type application in general. And you can see we've just got some CSS loading at the top, and we have a one tag, and it's the app tag. I'll show you that in just a moment, but that's all we have. Everything else gets loaded later. And then we're loading a couple of our libraries that we need. Currently, Tracer, I think, is still required. I'm not sure if they finally decoupled that, but Tracer will be stripped out of Angular 2 entirely if it hasn't already. So you can don't need to worry about that too much. And then we have System.js. System.js, we're only using it here, and all it's doing is basically kicking off the app. So we're configuring it a little bit, telling it where some of the libraries are. And then this is the key right here. We're importing our bootstrap, which is the first file of our application. And that file is going to handle starting our application. It's going to start loading anything that it needs. So everything that the application needs gets kicked off during this import step. So this is actually asynchronous. The whole page will load, and then system will load and fire off a request to load this bootstrap. So if we look at the bootstrap file, there are a couple things going on, but it's pretty simple right now. You can see we've got a reference to the typings again, but you'll see that in every file. First off, we're going to import the bootstrap service. So this is the import statement. Somewhere in Angular 2, it exports that. So we're importing that, and we're going to use it down here. We have router bindings. We have HTTP bindings. These are things that we just inject into the app. It's kind of like when you have a module dependency, you want to include those in your app like UI router or something. You're doing the same thing here. And then we're actually importing our app component, and we see it's a relative path to this particular file on the left. And we're going to pass that to the bootstrap function and pass the other things as an array. And that's what will fire everything else to begin executing. So bootstrap's a very similar concept to what you see in Angular 1, a little bit different syntax. You're just importing things, and then you're manually doing it. I'm not aware if there's an automatic way of doing it like you have ng-app today. I think this will be the approach that we're taking. So let's take a look at that app definition right now. So I'm going to close a few things here real quick. So right at the bottom, we have export class app. And that's our app. There's absolutely no logic in this directly inside of this, but this would be basically like the app controller for the whole application. Now, this isn't like a root scope thing exactly. This is a controller that would be only used for the app itself, for the app element itself. So what we're doing, though, is making that available to our bootstrap. So since we've exported it, our bootstrap file is able to import it. So you'll see that happen time and time again. Just want to make sure that was clear how that behaved. So this is the only thing that can be imported from this file because nothing else has the export keyword. So let's take a look at, we have this component annotation. I talked about those as the ES6 decorators. And so this annotates the class app as a component, and it gives it the selector of app. So that's why in the index file you see app. So this tag is based around whatever you place here. So I could call it my fabulous app. I could name it whatever I want, as long as those two match. And when I bootstrap, it will go through the DOM and find that element and turn it into my Angular app. If there's a mismatch, it won't be able to do it. There are a couple other properties that you might be able to put onto the component here. I'm not going to go over all of them, but you'll see one or two others throughout the example. A second annotation, so you can stack multiple annotations, is a view. And the view is going to be all the things that are related to the display. And so we have a template here, and this is the inline template here. And I'm using Material Design Lite's CSS styling, and so it's very a little bit more verbose perhaps than necessary, but all the classes and things need to be there for it to look this way. So I just put my template straight in line. I really like that. I think it's a really clean way of doing it for something this size. I'm under 40 lines of code for this file, and that's my app. So why not? And you can see we've got a nav bar up here, and then we've got kind of the body here. I'm going to come back to the router stuff in a little bit, because I think it makes more sense once you've seen a couple of the components. So I'll come back to that, but realize the app is sort of containing everything, and it fires off at runtime when we bootstrap it. So I want to take a look next at the stock services. So this is basically just a class. There's nothing fancy about it other than it leverages the HTTP service from Angular 2. So it's very possible that you can write a class that's agnostic to Angular. It could work, could be an Ember class, as long as nothing is dependent on Ember. Like, it could just be an ES6 class. It doesn't have to be Angularized in any way. And if you export it into your project, then anyone can use it and pull it into that anywhere else in the application. We're making a hard dependency, though, on the HTTP service. So we inject it into our service during our constructor. And you can see we've also typed a variable here. So this is a TypeScript definition. You can't do this in JavaScript, but TypeScript wants you to define your properties and what type they are. And so we do that at the beginning of the class. And so we're just injecting this HTTP service. We're also verifying that it's the HTTP type. And then we assign it to this.http. We set it on a property so that we can leverage it later on in our application. But then we just have a list of stocks up here at the top. So this local variable, let stocks, is an array of, these are the defaults that we're putting into our application. So this class has access to it because it's defined outside. And we can use a couple of methods. It's just a nice way of abstracting a little bit, but we can get the list. We can add a stock, which just pushes to that array, and then it returns the list. We can remove one, where it just splices from that array. And then the last method here is actually the HTTP request. And so we pass in, what are the symbols you want the data on? And it returns basically the HTTP response body back to whoever was asking for it. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But so it expects an array of those symbols, and those symbols get passed to the local API, which is an Express server that's running locally. This 2RX thing is about observables. There's a talk about observables later, so I'm going to leave that for a moment, but realize this has to do with the way that HTTP service is implemented. And we're looking at things more from a streaming perspective than like promises and callbacks. They're observables in JavaScript now, and we really want to leverage that in our Angular applications. So Rx is a library that helps us do that. All right. So the last thing here would be we're exporting also two things. So you can export multiple things from a single module, but we're going to export this interface because I want to have it other places in order to enforce that those arrays contain stocks. So that's the same thing you saw in the presentation. We have the symbol, the price, the change in percent. So all those things are now, those two things are exported, so I can import those individually or both of them at the same time into other modules. The first summary component is that card. So if I go back to here, this is the summary component. So it's going to pull in the stock interface because it's expecting that it receives a stock from the dashboard. So it's actually a subcomponent, if you want to think of it in the side of a DOM tree. It's underneath the dashboard. But we start off by importing, again, our components and views, and we're going to declare them down here. We're also going to see we have ng-if and ng-class. Those are familiar, and maybe you thought they would be going away. But in reality, they're re-implemented in a new way with Angular 2. So directives still exist. Directives are a little bit different conceptually, or they're a bit more narrow. They really only modify DOM. They're not a they don't let you make them as components that are actual elements. So they're really only attributes. and those attributes can modify the DOM, but they don't create a whole bunch of new DOM and can't be instantiated as a tag. So there's only a few of them. If, for, class, so they still have the ng prefix. So you'll see a couple of them in use here, but those are the core ones that we've over time have found to be the most useful and seem to satisfy like 95% of use cases. So we don't need to worry too much about all of them. So if we look at our new component, we give it a selector of summary. We also have a properties value here. And what we're doing is we're going to allow the stock, the summary component to receive a value. And that value can get injected into the controller. So the summary is now a bit abstracted. It's not actually, it's being passed stock information from somebody else. So it's not very knowledgeable about how to get the data or anything like that. It's only able to check if the data is correct and if it's received it. And once it's received it, tries to use it. So you can see in here we've got a stock value, and that gets mapped here. So in the stock, property is the local name, and then this is the value that is the attribute basically on an Angular. Inside of another component, you're going to see it as an attribute. So I'll show you that in just a moment. If we keep looking a little bit here, we can see we have these braces. These braces, we have asterisks, and these are all different ways of shortcoding some ways to impact the template. And so there's some really good blog posts about all of the semantics and the different ones. But this is like saying to evaluate what's inside of here. So the different types of symbols, whether they're wrapping the attribute or not, will modify the way that the expression inside is looked at. So in our case, we're going to be using this to check if that class is positive or negative based on is it more or less today in price than it was yesterday. So that's what the ng class here will allow us to do. So it's evaluating that, and then will automatically give us a class of increase or decrease. And ng class behaves pretty much the same way today in Angular 1. We have an asterisk here in front of the ng if, and this is like for conditional. So it's checking is the stock there. If not, it's not going to show the component. So if I don't pass the stock property to this particular component, it doesn't render. So it doesn't fail. It just doesn't do anything. And then we have our other types of bindings. We can do things like to uppercase. Since this is a string, I can still use whatever string methods I want inside of these expressions. Or we have pipes. I can pipe this through to a currency pipe, and we specify that we want it in US dollars. I forget what true is, but I needed it in order to then say how many decimal points. So right now the defaults pipes, at least the last time I checked, we're still requiring all these values. The defaults were not quite set up correctly. And then there's also a %1. There's about 7 or 8 different default pipes similar to the default filters we have now. So we can take a look at those in the Angular documentation when that gets fleshed out. And we can see we have a class here. So this is our controller for the component. And we have one value, which is the stock. And that's what's getting passed to us in this property. We also want to make sure that it is a stock interface. So we hope as we use it that everything is mapped correctly. And then all I have is the 2 methods that I need for the class, for the ng class, I should say. So is negative or is positive. And all it does is checks is the stock value there, and is the change greater than or equal to 0, then negative, or is it positive? And I can show you a little bit here as well. So as I start to do things, because I'm using TypeScript, you can see I have a lot of IDE support that's going to start suggesting things. It knows, hey, you have a property called stock. See, I defined it right here. So the IDE becomes aware of you have a stock property and you have 2 methods on this class. And so it's able to inspect the code and know exactly what's going on. So I can do this .stock. Oh, it even knows where the properties are because of the interface. So a lot of value here. If you don't like to document your code, then start typing stuff, because then you don't have to worry as much about, oh, was this a string or a number or what's going on. A lot of this stuff just starts bubbling up and becoming really, really cool. I could say, oh yeah, I want that. If I could say equals, say equal a string, there's a little error, and it says property should equal a number. And down here, it's an error code too. So it's telling me right away, hey, that's wrong. You need to make that a number. You can't use it like that. So I find that very, very useful when I'm working with TypeScript. It's part of the entire ecosystem. So I need to keep going real quick. So that's a summary component. Lots of stuff to look at. So inside of the dashboard component, we're going to actually import that. So we import our summary component. We're going to import a couple things as well. So the component views, ngIf, ng4. And we're also going to import, again, the stock service and the stock interface. The dashboard is going to basically act like our page. So it's like our parent controller here. It's going to be loading the data, and it's going to then loop over that data in order to create the different summary cards. So we have a selector of dashboard. We need to inject some things. So the summary, the stock service, this helps to inject this into our controller later. So that's one way of doing it. And then we also have a couple directives. We declare our summary as a directive just to inject it into the view, but we have ngIf and ng4 as well. And our template's simple. So if there's no stocks currently, then say loading. And otherwise, loop over stocks. So ng4 now is also an asterisk to make that an expression. But we have something called a local variable. And so this allows us to define a stock variable that we can use inside of this DOM node. So down here, when I use stock, it's referencing this. So it's a little syntactical change. And this is where we then pass that to the summary component. So we have a summary with an attribute symbol equals stock. And so it's going to evaluate the value of stock and pull that into and make the data available to the summary component, which we just saw. So we look at the dashboard class. It's all it's going to do is grab the symbols when it first loads. So it uses the stock service to get the current list of symbols. And then it uses the load method that we talked about. And subscribe is also part of the observable process. But basically, it's waiting for it to finish. And when it does, it's going to assign the resulting data, which is the array of stock data, to this .stocks. So this is an arrow function. It's keeping the local, it's keeping the lexical scope to the constructor function, so that this refers to the same this as this .symbols. Don't worry if that's all a little confusing. You're not familiar with lexical scope and these things. You can pick that up as we start working on more and more ES6 and classes. Help them kind of clean up some of that stuff as we go along. But realize that there is a reason for it being an arrow function here. So that is the dashboard component. So that makes up everything that you see on this page. So we talked about the service that's going to load the data, the dashboard, which loads the entire container to grab that data, and then loops over it to make each of these a little card for each of the stock data. So you see several things orchestrated together, and actually I don't even need that. You were wondering, that doesn't need to be there. So that's the dashboard class. Now I'm going to go back and look at the routing real quick. So now that we have an entire component, you can see how these things kind of will import their own dependencies. And so what our router now will do is basically map paths, URL paths, to a particular component. And this is a simple configuration. But there are many ways of configuring these to be much more complex than what you see here. But basically, I'm going to define two routes here, and one is just home, the backslash, and one is /manage. And here I'm giving it kind of a name, and this is the dashboard component. So I import the dashboard component and route it as the component for the particular path. And that's how now the router is going to know what to do depending on the URL. Likewise, I import the manage, which I'll show in just a moment, but that's how it gets injected here as one of the other paths. So that's what the route config annotation does. I like the syntax, and it's very clean like that. And then we have two things called the router outlet and the router link. And I kind of glossed over it and kind of ignored it earlier, but this is the spot here. The outlet is where the router is going to render itself. So UI router has a UI view. There's also ng view if you use the ng router. So these are all same concepts. The router outlet is actually kind of borrowed concept from Ember as far as the naming, and a lot of the features and concepts are borrowed from Ember's router. So it's really an interesting dynamic router, really, because it's so has so many use cases. But this outlet is where it will ultimately render itself. You can have multiple outlets. I don't have an example of that. You can have multiple routes active on a page at the same time. And there's a lot of complexity that it is capable of doing. But for purposes of getting a simple example, we have one. And then up here we have a router link, and this is linking to /dashboard. So this is using the naming syntax, but these are ways of, instead of using like ng href or ui sref attributes, you're going to use router dash link. And there are different ways of writing this, but this is basically saying go to the dashboard route. So this is the name. So go to the dashboard route or go to the manage route. So we have our router wired up here as well to grab our dashboard component. Let's take one look at the manage component, and then we'll kind of be able to wrap up everything that you've seen with some questions. The manage is a little bit different because it's going to import some form stuff. So our form builder is going to be useful at generating kind of form definitions. So ng form, like you're familiar with now, kind of bolts onto a form automatically. Here we're going to be a little bit more declarative in what exactly we're defining our form in JavaScript. Before, it's all about the markup. Now it's a little bit about JavaScript in the controller. So again, we're going to just import a bunch of things. Here's our selector, and then we've got to inject the form pieces into it. So here's our, this is actually the whole form right here. We have an ng form model, and it's going to reference a value called stock form. Now stock form I'm going to create down here in my controller, but just recognize that we'll be referencing that in a moment. And here is an event. So with parentheses around an attribute like this, it's basically an event. So when a particular event fires on this element, it's going to call this method. So when the submit method, or sorry, the submit event is called, it's going to call the add method. You could do a click, you could do a focus. Instead of having ng submit and ng everything, it's now just, if it's in a brace, it's treated like an event. And since you can also create your own events, it means that expands to any event that you might be able to bubble up and create on your own. So that's really, really neat and clean way of doing it. So this is just the form declaration, and then we have an ng control, which is different from ng model, but think of it as a similar construct, which will define exactly what this is in just a moment in the bottom, but we're referencing it here as the value of the input. And so the form model, stock form dot stock, is referencing this input, which is what you see here at the top. So that's the whole form. It's very simple. Didn't want to go into a ton of detail there, but there's lots of things you can do with it, validations and built-in validations and that kind of stuff that you're used to. Some of the syntax is still being worked on. Then we just have a table that loops over all of the symbols that are there. We have another click event that will remove that symbol if it's deleted, so it drops it from the list. And these things are going to call the controller method. So if I go down and take a look at the controller, it's a little bit more than some of the others. So our constructor will start off by getting the symbols and referencing the service. And here's our form builder. So this is the stock form that referenced at the form model. And we use the form builder to create a new group and give it a stock property. And I'm not passing anything as any of the default configuration. I'm just letting it be. You can leverage a lot of the configuration here. Still digging into all of that, but that is all you do to declare kind of what the form is. And then up here, you reference it in your model and then in your control. When I click the add button, or when I hit submit on the form, which is usually hitting the enter key, the add method gets called, and then it's going to actually use this .stockForm.value.stock to uppercase. So it's able to use the form that I created here, reference the value of the current input, make it uppercase because I think that's what I want all the values to be, and then it pushes it to the symbols array. And likewise, when I hit the remove button, it just removes it from the symbol. So using the stock form property here, we're able to reference the values when we need to. And there's actually several different ways of accomplishing similar things to this. So this is only one of the ways. And I think as the forms the APIs get finished up, that you'll see a lot more clean use cases and more complex ones. So that is a whirlwind tour. Hopefully I kept track of everyone all through that, but a whirlwind tour of what an Angular 2 application might look like with components importing other components and services and wiring those together with a router to see the end result of a 2-page app that lets you add and delete stocks as you wish. So with that, I am ready for some Q&A.
Sorry, it always takes me a minute to find the mute button. All righty, let's go ahead and ask some questions then. The first one is it possible to supply a URL to the slides?
For the overview of the different features of ES6 and ES7 and TypeScript, I can, yeah, I can put something up. I don't have anything up right now. It's a keynote. So I'll upload that somewhere and somehow post it back to the group.
Yeah, just email it to me and I'll get it into the forum.
Cool. I can do that.
All right. In app.ts, you have an app class tied to an app tag. Could you have two ng2 apps operating on the same page in different areas? Not 100% sure you'd want to do this, but curious.
So that's a good question. I actually haven't tried to instantiate and bootstrap two different apps at the same time. It's sort of a good, interesting question if that's a desirable use case, as you say, but at the moment I can't really answer that clearly because I haven't tried it. My gut says it's likely that they should both work because they would be isolated trees. And I just don't know how it would work from an efficiency standpoint too. If that is true, then they might both be loading their own dependencies and there could be a lot of overlap. And so I have to figure out how that would work in a real case.
Okay. The next one is, have you tried writing Angular 2 apps with ES6, not TypeScript, or ES5? And what are your thoughts if you have?
So I have used just ES6 without TypeScript. And I think it works great too. The typing information you lose, it's a preference thing. And some people might think it's a little bit more than they want to deal with. And I can understand that. But I think as you get a larger application, all of those pieces of information, the TypeScript, the leveraging the cleaner syntax that ES6 provides, will really, really help keep your code base concise and focused. When you start writing ES5, which is possible to write, and I haven't rewritten this whole thing in ES5. I've done a few snippets, but the other ways of doing it just aren't as clean. They take more code. They usually require calling functions that you have to pass objects. It's sort of a hybrid between what you see in Angular 2 and Angular 1 because it's bridging the gap of what ES5 does with ES6. So there's going to be, like the ng upgrade is going to make it possible for your Angular 1 apps to be written syntactically similar to Angular 2. So you'll get a taste of what that's like. And then when you can upgrade to Angular 2, you would have less migration to do. So there's going to be a lot of stuff out there, but I haven't done a ton of it on my own in ES5.
All right. Next question. This feels a little more verbose than Angular 1 in some ways. Are there places where we could have conventions or magic that make reasonable assumptions for you and make some of this disappear?
I think some of it's going to disappear. Brad said there's some niceties that they're working on. There's a couple of things that boilerplate things that are going to be cleaned up, reducing a little bit. If you go to the Angular in Action repo, there's an Angular 1 version of this app rewritten as Angular 1, almost identical, trying to keep it as similar one-to-one as possible. So you can pull that up and compare what do these two apps look like side by side, Angular 1, Angular 2. So check that out if you want to see that side by side. But once you verbose, I think it's perspective. I've been finding Angular 2 to be much less verbose because I'm not like a lot of the code here is actually my inline templates. If I remove all of that, this whole app was 150 lines of JavaScript, maybe less. And if you look at how much of it's actually a controller, we're talking very small amount. So I think it's about a perspective too on what's actually going on in here. I think the concepts of what's going on, it takes a little bit of time to adjust from Angular 1 to Angular 2. And once you've kind of sunk into, all right, I understand these are annotations that are creating components, it makes a lot more sense to me the way Angular 2 is going about things. It actually makes things shorter for writing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess for me, it feels a lot more explicit and almost a lot more like you're configuring stuff. Bring this in, use this, do this, as opposed to actually writing code.
Exactly, and that's a big reason I say TypeScript. It's just, it makes things very clear. Intentions are more clear. There are fewer concepts, actually. Like if you've seen the Angular 2 announcement, it was like a year ago when it was like RIP scope, and then they like killed off all these things in Angular 2, and then people bemoaned how are we going to learn this? Really, they didn't necessarily kill off all of the things as they did. They killed off the particular implementation. So the concepts are very similar, but some of them did completely drop and made this simpler. Like components are components. There's not like this directive API that we need everybody to learn the 50,000 ways of writing a directive in order to do all kinds of things, and then there's magic on top of it. So yeah, I think it's much more clean, clear, and focused.
All right. The last question is how are pipes different than filters or from filters? So
there's not a big difference. They are basically the same thing. They're just rewritten and renamed. So there's no filter, that kind of thing. So, and because of the pipe character, I guess it's just a common thing for other languages. So it seems like a good name. So I think it's mostly just that, a name change, and then obviously they're rewritten in ES6 and TypeScript. But fundamentally they behave the same.
All right. Well, there aren't any other questions in the Q&A, so we'll go ahead and wrap this talk up. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
All right. We will take a half-hour break, and then we will come back in a half hour. Also, while I have your attention, I did get the website up for JavaScript Remote Conf or JS Remote Conf. If you look in the community forum, there's actually a discount code in there. So go check it out. That is the largest discount I'm going to offer anyone, and it's just because you guys are awesome. So, but yeah, that's it. So thank you again, Jeremy. I think it really gives us a glimpse into what we're going to be doing with Angular 2.